Miss Marple is called upon when a wilted corsage is discovered beside an untimely death, and she soon learns the withered flowers conceal the clue that reveals a killer. Chapter 1. The Rose Queen's Last Waltz. Annual St. Mildred's Garden Fete was an event of deep-rooted tradition in the village of Little Fallowford. It was the kind of affair where lemon drizzle cakes were judged with the severity of a courtroom trial, and the prize marrow was the subject of whispered envy. Beneath parasols and bunting, life carried on in its genteel rhythm, with lace-gloved hands and knowing glances across tea saucers. Miss Marple, dressed in pale blue with a lace collar, arrived just after 2:30, accompanied by her friend Charlotte de Betrayal, the vicar's clever niece. They wandered past the jam table, the bric-a-brac stall, and the rows of chairs lining the central green. "Everyone's here," Charlotte murmured. "Mr. Drummond brought that noisy Labrador again, and Mrs. Ann Struther is pretending not to notice that her sponge cake has collapsed in the middle." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I've always thought sponge cakes are terribly vulnerable to disappointment. A collapsed middle, I find, usually mirrors the baker's own state of mind." Charlotte giggled. "Then hers must be positively melancholic." A burst of applause drew their attention toward the center of the fete. The Rose Queen procession was beginning. Clara Carradine, the newly crowned Rose Queen, stood beneath a rose-covered archway, 18 and ethereal in a white dress. Her crown of pink tea roses sat just askew on her golden curls. Her smile wavered under the scrutiny of villagers, and her hands gripped her bouquet a little too tightly. Something in her expression made Miss Marple lean forward. "She doesn't look happy," Charlotte whispered. "No," said Miss Marple. "She doesn't." At that moment, a stir rippled through the crowd. From behind the trestle tables, a figure emerged. Uninvited and unmistakable Verity Talbot, Clara's mother. Clara's face paled. Verity wore an old-fashioned silk dress in faded lavender, and a matching hat adorned with a wilting feather. Pinned to her shoulder was a corsage yellowed gardenias and baby's breath, with one rose browned at the edges. People parted in awkward silence as she moved unsteadily toward her daughter. With theatrical flourish, Verity approached the dais, reached out, and fussed with Clara's sash. The crowd watched, frozen. Clara recoiled. Verity whispered something into her daughter's ear, too quiet to be heard, yet sharp enough that Clara's mouth twitched. Then, just as suddenly, Verity turned and made her way toward the refreshment tent, as though nothing had happened. Murmurs followed her like nettle seeds on the wind. 5 minutes later, Verity collapsed beside the punch bowl. Inspector Colin March was called to the scene from nearby Alton, fresh-faced and full of ambition. He surveyed the body with a cursory glance. Overexertion or alcohol, he concluded to the assembled crowd. No signs of foul play. "These things happen in warm weather," Dr. Elspeth Mowbray, the village's stern-faced physician, disagreed. "I've treated Verity before. She was vain, yes, but sound of body. Her hands were clenched when I found her. There was something in her eyes, fear. Real fear." Miss Marple stood nearby, her expression unreadable. Her gaze wandered from the late Mrs. Talbot to the bouquet still clutched in Clara's hands, then to the wilting corsage lying askew on Verity's chest. She didn't call out. Miss Marple remarked to no one in particular. Charlotte blinked. "Who didn't?" "Clara," she replied. When her mother collapsed, no cry of alarm, no rush forward. Charlotte looked over. Clara stood beneath the rose archway, flanked by the vicar and her godmother, Mrs. Lindale. Her cheeks were flushed, but not from grief. She might have been in shock. Charlotte offered gently. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "There are many kinds of shock." By evening, the fete had disbanded. Tables were cleared, the music stopped, and the bunting fluttered half-heartedly in the evening breeze. News of Verity's death traveled quickly. The ladies' embroidery circle convened an impromptu meeting, and the tea room hummed with speculation. "She's always been dramatic," said Mrs. Denholm, peering over her glasses. "You remember the business with the raffle tickets? Deliberately dropped her own name in 5 times, and then cried sabotage, poisoned," muttered Mrs. Flitch from the back. "That's what I think. That punch was to red, scarlet, suspicious. She drank from her own flask, didn't she?" countered Miss Biddle. "That dreadful violet hip flask she carried everywhere, never trusted anyone else's refreshments." "No, no," said Mr. Cartwright, polishing his spectacles. "It wasn't the drink, it was that whisper." Did anyone see Clara's face when her mother spoke to her? Pure dread. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner of the tea room, sipped her Earl Grey and listened. Listening, after all, was an underestimated art. As the group argued, her eyes drifted to the corsage again, the shriveled bloom pinned to Verity's chest. It had seemed almost grotesquely out of place, the only item that hadn't wilted with her collapse. Charlotte leaned in. "Do you really think it wasn't natural?" "I rarely think in absolutes," said Miss Marple, "but unnatural things often announce themselves quietly, like a stitch out of place in a doily." The comment went unnoticed by the others, but Miss Marple continued watching, her pale eyes tracing invisible patterns. She had already begun to sow the first threads of suspicion. Chapter 2. Whispers and Wildflowers. Be Sunday morning. Little Fallowford was awash with quiet conjecture. The village lanes, usually thick with birdsong and the smell of fresh-cut grass, now carried whispers like drifting pollen. Verity Talbot's sudden collapse at the fete had shaken the village. Not because of the loss itself, Verity had long been a figure of scorn and drama, but because of the oddities surrounding it. Miss Marple, as was her habit, took her morning walk to the churchyard, not out of morbid interest but for routine and thought. The dew was still fresh on the gravestones. The bells had not yet rung. It was in this silence that she mulled over the image of Verity's corsage to gardenias. She murmured aloud, "A frilled bit of baby's breath, and one yellow rose, old-fashioned, not at all like Verity's usual flair, and dried at the edges, almost brittle." Miss Marple paused near the bench by the light gate. Her eyes softened as she sat, folding her hands in her lap. It was the kind of morning where nothing felt out of place until you thought harder. At the Talbot residence, the morning was taut with quiet unrest. Clara Carradine sat at the breakfast table, staring into a cup of untouched tea. She had shed her rose queen sash and crown, and her once pristine dress hung limp over her shoulders. Across from her, Aunt Eloise, a stout woman with a commanding voice, chopped her eggs with the precision of a court executioner. "You must eat something," Eloise said. "I'm not hungry." Clara murmured, "Refusing nourishment will not bring your mother back." Clara winced. Eloise sighed, more exasperated than sympathetic. "We must prepare. People will come. They always do after death, like birds to crumbs. I'll have to speak to Mr. Featherstone about the arrangements." "Do we need a service?" Clara asked, her voice brittle. Eloise glanced up. "One always needs a service, no matter what people thought of her." Clara looked away. She would have wanted a parade. She'll get hymnals and lukewarm coffee. That's all she ever truly earned. The bell rang sharply. Clara rose to answer it, grateful for escape. On the doorstep stood Miss Marple, dressed in her dove-gray coat and a hat that had weathered 20 spring seasons. She held a small posy of snowdrops and purple hyacinths, early bloomers for the season. "Miss Carradine," she said gently, "forgive the intrusion. I thought perhaps you might like some flowers for the table." Clara hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside. Miss Marple entered with unassuming grace. The sitting room bore the traces of Verity's personality: floral upholstery, mismatched ornaments, and a framed photo of herself as the queen of the spring parade 25 years ago. A younger Verity, radiant and posing beside a man whose face had been hastily folded out of sight. "Your mother enjoyed attention," Miss Marple observed softly. "She needed it," Clara said. "Not turning around. Need is a strange thing. It can make people terribly afraid of being forgotten." There was a pause. "Did she tell you something at the fete?" Miss Marple asked gently. Before she collapsed, Clara's shoulders stiffened. "No, it was just nonsense. She said I would regret it all. All." She didn't explain. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Sometimes people don't explain when they think they've already told you everything." Clara bit her lip. "She kept secrets. Always little things. About my father, about her life before here. I don't think I ever truly knew her. Few daughters do. Mothers are rarely who they pretend to be, even to themselves." Miss Marple placed the flowers on the table, beside a bowl of withered potpourri. The contrast was stark. Back at the vicarage, Reverend Pargeter sat with Inspector March in the drawing room, both men nursing cups of weak tea. "I still think it was natural," March said, almost defensively. "She was unstable, everyone knows that. Overheated, stressed, poison, perhaps." The vicar suggested delicately. March waved it away. "There's no evidence. No strange liquids. No broken glass. Even the flask clean as a whistle." "Then how do you explain the doctor's concern?" "I don't," March said. "But I'm not about to accuse anyone based on a wilting corsage and some village gossip." Miss Marple, who had quietly entered during this exchange having been invited for tea, stirred her cup. Without looking up, "It's odd though, Inspector, isn't it? That someone so fond of dramatic exits made her final scene in complete silence." March frowned. "What do you mean?" She collapsed behind the punch table. "Not in front of a crowd. Not on the days. No screaming. No declarations. Very unlike her." The vicar looked thoughtful. "It was rather quiet." Miss Marple smiled. "One wonders if that's how she truly meant it to happen, or if someone else preferred it that way." By late afternoon, the village was abuzz again. Mr. Cartwright swore he'd seen Clara tear up a letter in the churchyard. Mrs. Flitch reported that Verity's hip flask had gone missing, only to be found in the refuse bin behind the floral tent, empty, clean, and curiously scented with aniseed. Aniseed, Miss Marple noted privately, could be used to mask bitter tastes. At dusk, Charlotte joined Miss Marple for a slow walk through the meadow path near the Grange. "You think she was murdered?" Charlotte said. "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that no one carries a brown corsage unless it means something, especially a woman like Verity Talbot." "What could it mean?" Miss Marple looked out across the fading light. "That someone wanted to remind her of something, or punish her for remembering too well." They walked on. Behind them, the village carried on, but the faint rustle of secrets was growing louder. Chapter 3. The corsage that shouldn't have been. Monday after the fete dawned with a low-hanging fog, softening the outlines of cottages and hedgerows in Little Fallowford. By mid-morning, the mist had lifted just enough for villagers to resume their routines, albeit with an edge of tension humming beneath the everyday. Word of Verity Talbot's death had spread with the same quiet urgency as a cat slipping through the hedges, unseen but undeniably present. Miss Marple, seated by her front window with a neat embroidery hoop in her lap, had paused mid-stitch. The needle remained poised in the air as she watched a figure approach from the lane, a trim silhouette in a well-tailored coat, walking with the stiffness of someone unused to village terrain. It was Mr. Lionel Hawthorne, the solicitor from Bexbury, known for overseeing the estates of the more complicated residents of the county. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. That he was here, barely 48 hours after Verity's sudden passing, was a detail worth noting. She opened the door before he could knock. Double quotes Miss Marple, he said, bowing slightly. "I hope I'm not intruding. I've just come from the Talbot residence." "Of course," she replied with her usual warmth. "Would you care for tea?" He looked mildly alarmed. "I'm afraid I haven't time. I've only a few minutes before returning to Bexbury. But I thought you ought to know. There's been a change to Miss Talbot's will." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Oh, rather unexpected. She revised it only a month ago. Left everything house, savings, what little there was to her daughter, naturally. But there's one odd clause. She requested that an embroidered doily be given directly to you." "To me?" Miss Marple blinked. "Well, that is odd. She was specific. It's in her bedroom, apparently wrapped in blue tissue paper in the drawer of her vanity. I suggested Miss Carradine deliver it when she's able. Until then, it will remain secured." Miss Marple offered a gentle nod. "Thank you for telling me." Hawthorne tipped his hat. "Strange woman, Miss Talbot. I always thought her theatrical, but not without a certain flair for surprise." As he disappeared down the lane, Miss Marple remained at the threshold, thoughtful. Across the village, the vicar's wife had gathered a small group of women at the parish hall, under the pretext of organizing condolence baskets. Miss Marple, arriving a few minutes late, slipped in beside Mrs. Finch and nodded politely as she took a seat. "We're thinking flowers." "Mostly," Mrs. Roper was saying. "Perhaps a sponge cake or two. Clara's lost weight," muttered Mrs. Draper, sorting tins. "You can tell. Grief doesn't flatter the young." "She's pale," added Mrs. Finch. "But who wouldn't be? Imagine growing up under that woman's roof." "I heard," Mrs. Draper said, lowering her voice, "that Verity fainted because of a shock." "Something someone said." Mrs. Roper frowned. "What sort of something?" "Well," she said with relish, "someone mentioned a man from years ago, a name she hadn't heard in decades." Miss Marple looked up. "Do you recall the name?" Mrs. Draper faltered. "It might have been Lansing or Lanchester. Something with an L." Miss Marple's gaze dropped back to her knitting. "How curious," she murmured. "The mind does store names like secrets in jars. Sometimes they burst open at the oddest moment." By late afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once more at the Talbot house. Clara had sent for her, though the note had been brief. The tone was unmistakably uncertain, even urgent. "I wanted to give you this," Clara said as she met her in the hallway. Her face was pale, but composed. "I found it wrapped in tissue, just as Mr. Hawthorne said." She held out the doily. Miss Marple took it gently. It was delicate ivory linen, rimmed with hand-done lace. In the center, a cluster of embroidered wildflowers. Daisies, thistles, forget-me-nots. Not Verity's style at all. "I didn't know she sewed," Clara said. "She didn't," Miss Marple replied. "But she once told me her mother did. Very fine work. She learned to appreciate it later in life." Clara paused. "Is it important?" "I believe it may be," Miss Marple said, folding it carefully. "Thank you for bringing it to me." Later that evening, Miss Marple examined the doily in her parlor, laying it flat on a white linen cloth beneath her reading lamp. The work was neat, yet dated colors ever so slightly faded. But there was something curious. The embroidery thread formed not just flowers, but a shape beneath them. Almost obscured by the thistle petals was a letter, an L, woven in fine brown thread, almost indistinguishable from the stem beside it. She leaned closer. The L was followed by a faint A, then perhaps an N. Lan. "Castor," she whispered. "Or Landon?" The memory stirred Mrs. Draper's half-recalled name. The man Verity hadn't heard mentioned in years. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her brow furrowed. The corsage, the doily, the name, the pieces were not yet arranged, but she could feel them beginning to lean toward one another like magnets beneath paper, tugging invisible lines closer. Outside, the sky faded to indigo. Inside, Miss Marple quietly pressed the doily between tissue and slipped it into a book of local genealogy. For now, the secret was still sewn into fabric. But soon, it would begin to unravel. Chapter 4. The Forgotten Mammoth Morning after receiving the doily. Miss Marple took an early walk to the churchyard. Her steps were slow and unhurried, but her mind moved quickly. A name half sewn into fabric, a woman fainting at the mention of a man from long ago, and a doily that should never have come from Verity's hand. All these were threads, and she, with delicate precision, meant to tug them loose. The grass around the gravestones glistened with dew, and the sharp scent of wet lichen rose in the air. Miss Marple paused at a modest headstone nestled between two larger tombs. She read the inscription, Edith Lanchester 1872 to 1941. She bore her silence with grace. Lanchester. There it was. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Edith Lanchester had been Verity's mother. That much she remembered. But there had been no mention of a Mr. Lanchester. Edith had arrived in Little Fallowford a widow, or so the village assumed. Quiet, refined, distant. She never spoke of her past. Miss Marple stood for several minutes, listening not to sound, but to what the silence hinted at, an absence too large to go unnoticed. By midday, the village was buzzing again. The local constable, a young man named Inspector Felix Grant, had begun casual questioning. He wasn't precisely unwelcome, but the villagers treated him with polite irritation, as though his badge were a reminder that life was not quite as safe as it had once been. Grant paid Miss Marple a visit just after her midday tea. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap, "mind if I trouble you for a few thoughts?" "I rarely object to a pleasant conversation," she replied with a twinkle. Grant sat across from her, glancing once at the lace doily laid neatly on a side table. "Word is Miss Talbot collapsed suddenly. No sign of poison or violence, at least, none apparent. But something's off." Miss Marple folded her hands. "You suspect foul play?" He hesitated. "I'm not sure, but I do know Clara Carradine hasn't spoken to half the visitors who passed through the fete. She's closed, she's frightened," Miss Marple corrected gently, "and very likely protecting someone." Grant nodded. "You have a gift for these things, Miss Marple." She smiled thinly. "Only an old woman who has spent a lifetime watching others behave very much like themselves." He laughed, but then turned serious. "Did you happen to see what Verity was wearing? Some say she had a corsage pinned to her dress." "I did notice it," Miss Marple said. "White carnations. Slightly wilted, I thought. Rather out of season. Curious, isn't it?" "That's what I thought. Clara says she didn't bring it for her mother, and no one at the floral stall admits to arranging it." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Then someone brought it deliberately. A quiet message. A memory, perhaps, or a warning." Grant leaned forward. "You think someone wanted to unsettle her? Perhaps, or remind her of something she wished to forget." Meanwhile, at the edge of the village, Clara Carradine sat in the sunroom of her now empty house, staring at her mother's unused embroidery frame. She had not touched it in years. Her fingers drifted over the threads, some still looped in the needle. They were old, brittle, not Verity's style. The silence in the house was no longer serene. It was thick like dust left behind when something heavy had been lifted too suddenly. She rose and opened the drawer of her mother's dressing table, where the corsage had been carefully placed in a saucer. The carnations were yellowing now, curling at the edges. There was something beneath them. Clara lifted the flowers, her heart quickening. Tucked beneath the saucer was a narrow envelope, sealed with wax, no name. Just a single pressed thistle affixed to the flap. That evening, Clara arrived unannounced at Miss Marple's cottage. "I found this," she said without preamble, handing her the envelope. "I think she meant it for someone. Maybe you." Miss Marple took it with a nod and offered tea, which Clara declined. As the younger woman sat fidgeting with her gloves, Miss Marple opened the envelope delicately. Inside was a short letter, only a few lines, written in Verity's unmistakable, slanted hand. "To whom it may concern, if you found this. You already know what I feared would one day return. The man from my mother's past, his shadow was never far behind. If anything happens to me, seek the name that was never spoken. The secret lies in the stitches." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope. "What does it mean?" Clara asked, her voice low. "It means," Miss Marple said gently, "that your mother feared someone very old had come back into her life, or perhaps into yours." Clara stared. "But who?" Miss Marple gave her a long, thoughtful look. "Tell me, my dear, did your mother ever speak of your grandfather?" Clara shook her head. "Never. I assumed he died young. That may be true, but perhaps not in the way you imagined." As Clara left, Miss Marple returned to her parlor and opened the doily once more. This time, she examined the reverse side. There, among the neat white stitches, was a thread out of place, just a sliver, dyed crimson and sewn in the shape of an inverted thistle. Not decorative. A signature. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a firm line. She now had a name, a clue, and a symbol, but not yet the whole story. That, she knew, would come only when the final thread was pulled. Chapter 5, Threads That Never Unraveleth. Next morning brought a steady drizzle to Little Fallowford, softening the village's edges with mist and dampening the petals on every rose. Miss Marple sat by her window with a pot of strong Ceylon tea and her knitting at hand. Though she hardly moved her needles, her mind was busy with more intricate weaving threads that stretched across decades, into houses where names had gone unspoken for far too long. At 9:10, a discreet knock sounded at her door. It was Inspector Felix Grant again, looking slightly less sure of himself than the day before. "Miss Marple," he began, brushing water from his sleeves, "I thought you might like to see this." He produced a small, crumpled sheet of music paper enclosed in a plastic folder. Miss Marple took it delicately, reading the title aloud. "The Larch Waltz." By Yell. She blinked. "It's a composition. Found it in Verity Talbot's sewing cabinet," said Grant. "Tucked behind the drawer. Seems out of place. It's not recent. The paper's yellowed, and the ink is faded." "Yell," Miss Marple murmured. "Edith Lanchester?" "So it seems. But there's more." He handed her a second slip of paper, smaller, bearing a note in Verity's hand. This was all he left behind. "I kept it because I couldn't forget. But Clara must never see it." Miss Marple sat in silence. Her tea went cold. She looked out toward the garden, where a single thistle had somehow taken root among the hollyhocks, bold, intrusive, unwelcome. "Do you know who he was?" Grant asked quietly. "I believe I may," Miss Marple said, "though the full tale hasn't quite emerged yet." Meanwhile, Clara Carradine made her way to the village records office, which was little more than a filing room tucked behind the library. The clerk, Mr. Catteridge, was a stooped man with remarkable recall for other people's secrets and a suspicious fondness for licorice all sorts. "Ah, Miss Carradine," he said, peering over his spectacles. "Something I can help with?" "I was hoping to look at birth records," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Around 1901 or 1902 for the Lanchester family." Catteridge squinted. Lanchester. "Yes, Edith Lanchester gave birth around then, didn't she? Odd case. No father's name ever listed." Clara's breath caught. She named the child Verity Elaine Lanchester. "Born April 1902. That's all it says. No witnesses, no father's details." It was a quiet affair, very hush-hush. Clara stared at the file. "Did anyone ever ask questions?" "Not in those days," he said with a chuckle. "Single mothers had to choices, keep quiet or leave town. Edith did both, in her way. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple had begun rereading the note that came with the corsage. A thought occurred to her. If the thistle was a signature, it might not belong to Verity or Edith but to the man they feared. She retrieved a slim volume from her shelf, an anthology of botanical folklore, and thumbed through the pages until she reached an entry on thistles. In Victorian flower language, the thistle represented both defiance and remembrance. It was also used, in certain circles, as a warning, a reminder of pain inflicted. That evening, as the rain began to clear, she paid a visit to Mrs. Temple, the widow who had once been the church organist and remembered every funeral she'd ever attended. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "do you recall Edith Lanchester's funeral?" "Of course I do," said Mrs. Temple, bustling with the pride of memory. "She died in '41. Quiet ceremony. Only 4 people attended. Verity, myself, the vicar, and oh yes, the oddest part, an out-of-town gentleman. Gray suit, little mustache, sharp accent. Didn't speak to a soul. Paid for the headstone." "Paid for the headstone?" "Indeed. Verity never said a word about him. I assumed he was a relative. But now I wonder." "So do I," Miss Marple said. Later that night, a flickering candle glowed inside Miss Marple's parlor. She unfolded the doily again, this time laying it beside the music sheet. It struck her that the embroidery stitches and the musical notes bore a curious similarity. Not in content, of course, but in form, rhythm, flow. She examined the crimson thread once more. There were 7 stitches, slightly curved, diverging from the thistle's base. A flourish, or a code? Miss Marple fetched a magnifying glass and peered closer. The threads were aligned to mimic a clef. Not a treble clef, but a bass clef used often in cello or left-hand piano compositions. She smiled faintly. "If one were leaving a signature," she whispered, "what better way than in the medium you loved most?" The next day, Miss Marple invited Clara to tea once again. They sat beneath the vine-covered trellis, where bees hummed lazily over late roses. "I believe your grandfather was not merely absent," Miss Marple began, but deliberately erased. Clara looked up sharply. "The initials EL may belong to Edith Lanchester, but I believe the composition, the Larch Waltz, was not hers. She preserved it because it was written by the man she loved, the man who vanished." Clara's hands trembled. "Do you know who he was?" Miss Marple nodded. "He was a musician, one who could not marry Edith, either by law or circumstance. He left, or was sent away. But he returned once, for her funeral. He left a mark, musical, symbolic, and embroidered into this doily as a warning." Clara stared at the lace, at the crimson stitches shaped like music. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Someone else now knows about this man. Someone who feared what Verity might reveal, and they tried to silence her." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "I believe so, but we don't yet know who, or why they feared her story." As dusk fell, Miss Marple watched a single thistle sway in her garden's breeze, its purple bloom catching the last of the sunlight. The threads were tightening, and soon someone would find themselves tangled in their own forgotten tune. Chapter 5, Threads That Never Unraveleth. Next morning brought a steady drizzle to Little Fallowford, softening the village's edges with mist and dampening the petals on every rose. Miss Marple sat by her window with a pot of strong Ceylon tea and her knitting at hand. Though she hardly moved her needles, her mind was busy with more intricate weaving threads that stretched across decades, into houses where names had gone unspoken for far too long. At 9:10, a discreet knock sounded at her door. It was Inspector Felix Grant again, looking slightly less sure of himself than the day before. "Miss Marple," he began, brushing water from his sleeves, "I thought you might like to see this." He produced a small, crumpled sheet of music paper enclosed in a plastic folder. Miss Marple took it delicately, reading the title aloud. "The Larch Waltz, by E.L." She blinked. "It's a composition, founded in Verity Talbot's sewing cabinet," said Grant, "tucked behind the drawer. Seems out of place. It's not recent. The paper's yellowed, and the ink is faded." Miss Marple murmured. Edith Lanchester? So it seems. But there's more. He handed her a second slip of paper, smaller, bearing a note in Verity's hand. This was all he left behind. I kept it because I couldn't forget. But Clara must never see it. Miss Marple sat in silence. Her tea went cold. She looked out toward the garden, where a single thistle had somehow taken root among the hollyhocks, bold, intrusive, unwelcome. Do you know who he was? Grant asked quietly. I believe I may, Miss Marple said, though the full tale hasn't quite emerged yet. Meanwhile, Clara Carradine made her way to the village record's office, which was little more than a filing room tucked behind the library. The clerk, Mr. Catteridge, was a stooped man with remarkable recall for other people's secrets and a suspicious fondness for licorice all sorts. Miss Carradine, he said, peering over his spectacles. Something I can help with? I was hoping to look at birth records, she said, keeping her voice steady. Around 1901 or 1902, for the Lanchester family. Catteridge squinted. Lanchester. Yes, Edith Lanchester gave birth around then, didn't she? Odd case. No father's name ever listed. Clara's breath caught. She named the child Verity Elaine Lanchester. Born April 1902. That's all it says. No witnesses, no father's details. It was a quiet affair, very hush-hush. Clara stared at the file. Did anyone ever ask questions? Not in those days, he said with a chuckle. Single mothers had to choices: keep quiet or leave town. Edith did both, in her way. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple had begun rereading the note that came with the corsage. A thought occurred to her. If the thistle was a signature, it might not belong to Verity or Edith, but to the man they feared. She retrieved a slim volume from her shelf, an anthology of botanical folklore, and thumbed through the pages until she reached an entry on thistles. In Victorian flower language, the thistle represented both defiance and remembrance. It was also used, in certain circles, as a warning, a reminder of pain inflicted. That evening, as the rain began to clear, she paid a visit to Mrs. Temple, the widow who had once been the church organist and remembered every funeral she'd ever attended. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, do you recall Edith Lanchester's funeral? Of course I do, said Mrs. Temple, bustling with the pride of memory. She died in '41. Quiet ceremony. Only 4 people attended. Verity, myself, the vicar, and oh yes, the honest part, an out-of-town gentleman. Gray suit, little mustache, sharp accent. Didn't speak to a soul. Paid for the headstone. Indeed, Verity never said a word about him. I assumed he was a relative. But now I wonder. So do I, Miss Marple said. Later that night, a flickering candle glowed inside Miss Marple's parlor. She unfolded the doily again, this time laying it beside the music sheet. It struck her that the embroidery stitches and the musical notes bore a curious similarity. Not in content, of course, but in form, rhythm, flow. She examined the crimson thread once more. There were 7 stitches, slightly curved, diverging from the thistle's base. A flourish, or a code. Miss Marple fetched a magnifying glass and peered closer. The threads were aligned to mimic a clef. Not a treble clef, but a bass clef used often in cello or left-hand piano compositions. She smiled faintly. If one were leaving a signature, she whispered, what better way than in the medium you loved most? The next day, Miss Marple invited Clara to tea once again. They sat beneath the vine-covered trellis, where bees hummed lazily over late roses. I believe your grandfather was not merely absent, Miss Marple began, but deliberately erased. Clara looked up sharply. The initials EL may belong to Edith Lanchester, but I believe the composition, the Larch Waltz, was not hers. She preserved it because it was written by the man she loved, the man who vanished. Clara's hands trembled. Do you know who he was? Miss Marple nodded. He was a musician, one who could not marry Edith, either by law or circumstance. He left or was sent away. But he returned once, for her funeral. He left a mark musical, symbolic, and embroidered into this doily as a warning. Clara stared at the lace, at the crimson stitches shaped like music. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. Someone else now knows about this man. Someone who feared what Verity might reveal, and they tried to silence her. Miss Marple gave a slow nod. I believe so, but we don't yet know who, or why they feared her story. As dusk fell, Miss Marple watched a single thistle sway in her garden's breeze, its purple bloom catching the last of the sunlight. The threads were tightening, and soon, someone would find themselves tangled in their own forgotten tune. Chapter 6, The Man Who Didn't Exist It, was a peculiarity of Miss Marple's intellect, that once her mind caught the scent of a half-buried truth, it would not rest. That morning, the sun made a timid reappearance over Little Fallowford, drying the garden leaves and bringing the hum of bees back to the hedgerows. But even the pleasant weather could not distract her from the one question that had begun to ring louder in her thoughts. Who was the man in the gray suit? And why did no one know his name? She made her way to the library, where the records from the 1940s were kept in brittle folders and forgotten ledgers. There, the ever-obliging Mrs. Penwhistle, whose spectacles always perched at the tip of her nose, helped Miss Marple retrieve the burial register for the parish. Here it is, she murmured. Edith Lanchester, died 1941, buried April 12th. The fee for the headstone was paid in cash, rather unusual. No signature, but a note by request of a friend. Anonymous. Miss Marple leaned closer. No other name at all? None. Miss Marple's fingers paused over the page. Was there a receipt for the stonemason? Mrs. Penwhistle blinked. Well, I suppose it's possible. They'd be kept in the trades ledger, though I doubt we'd find anything that specific. But Miss Marple had already turned to the tall wooden drawer, where the invoices and receipts lived in quietly chaotic peace. It took her the better part of 20 minutes, but her persistence bore fruit. A yellowed slip, dated March 28, 1941. It bore no name, but it did list a return address simply, Nt. C. O. Bracondale Hall, Wiltshire. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She murmured, Bracondale Hall. Bracondale Hall, as it turned out, was an estate of some grandeur about 15 miles from Little Fallowford, though its name was well known in the county. The current owner was an elusive figure, a reclusive pianist named Maurice Thorne, who had long since retreated from public life. He had been a minor sensation in the 1920s, known for haunting compositions and a tragic performance career that had ended after a breakdown. During a recital in Vienna. Miss Marple had heard of him. Everyone with an ear for music had. But what piqued her interest was not his fame, it was the coincidence of initials. Nt. Could Maurice Thorne have been Verity's father, or perhaps something more complicated still? She turned the thought over as she walked back through the village. It was then she spotted Clara Carradine seated by the duck pond, a book in her lap but unread, her gaze fixed on the ripples in the water. Miss Marple approached gently. I've found something, my dear. Clara looked up. Is it about Verity's father? Perhaps. There's a musician, Maurice Thorne, who lived not far from here. He was brilliant but troubled, and he disappeared from the public shortly before Verity was born. He paid for Edith's grave marker, quietly. I believe he was the man Verity's mother loved. Clara's expression was unreadable. And you think he came back only once, for Edith's funeral, but someone else found out, and someone didn't want that truth unburied. Meanwhile, Inspector Grant was making inquiries of his own. The discovery of the music sheet had unsettled him, not because of its age, but because the handwriting on the envelope matched that of the note found in Verity's corsage box. He visited the shop in Much Lilling where Verity had the corsage made. The florist, a cheerful woman named Olive Marsh, remembered the order. She wanted something symbolic, Olive said. Unusual, I thought a thistle, stitched into the corsage fabric. Said it had to look natural, not like an embellishment. Did she say why? She only said it had to mean something to the person who saw it. I thought it was for someone sentimental, maybe a lover. But, well, when I heard she'd died, it made me go cold. Grant scribbled a note in his book. Was anyone with her when she placed the order? Olive nodded. Yes, actually. Clara Carradine. They argued about it quietly, but enough that I noticed. Clara said it was excessive, that no one would understand it. Verity insisted. She was determined. Grant left with more questions than answers. That evening, Miss Marple hosted both Grant and Clara for tea. She'd baked seed cake and placed the doily with the thistle embroidery at the center of the table, though neither guest knew its significance yet. Inspector, she said as she poured, have you ever noticed that some people hide their pain in plain view? I suppose, he said, careful not to knock over his cup. But how does that help us find a killer? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because the killer did exactly the opposite. They hid their guilt behind someone else's pain. She turned to Clara. My dear, did Verity ever mention Maurice Thorne to you? Clara shook her head. Never, but she left you the doily. She left you music. She left you a puzzle she hoped only you or someone like you might solve. Miss Marple paused. And someone else, someone who feared that solution, tried to remove her before she could speak plainly. Who? Clara asked, voice trembling. Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she said, people speak volumes in silences. We must listen carefully. As dusk fell, a solitary figure made his way through the cemetery behind St. Bartholomew's. He stood before Edith Lanchester's headstone, a gray overcoat wrapped tightly round him, and placed a single thistle on the grave. He did not notice the woman watching from a distance, small, elderly, barely visible behind a flowering hawthorn. Miss Marple lowered her binoculars and whispered to herself, at last, the man who didn't exist. Chapter 7. The thistle that spoke twice. Eve next morning found little Fallowford cloaked in a thin mist, as though the village itself had paused to breathe in the hush between secrets uncovered and truths yet to be faced. Miss Marple, as ever, was up early, her breakfast tray left untouched while she stood at her front window, looking not at the lane below but inward toward the tangle of memory, intuition, and deduction where she did her clearest thinking. The sight of the man at Edith Lanchester's grave the previous evening had confirmed what she had long suspected. Someone from the past had returned, quietly and with purpose. The thistle laid so reverently could not be coincidence, and if her instincts were correct, Maurice Thorne, the once brilliant pianist and Edith's vanished lover, was still very much alive, and someone knew it. She wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and set out for a walk. Her route, by deliberate chance, took her past Roseview Cottage, where Clara Carradine was tending to a patch of late dahlias. Clara glanced up and, seeing Miss Marple approach, wiped her hands on her apron. You're early. Miss Marple, I often am, my dear. Thought I'd take the air while it's still soft. May I trouble you for a word? Clara nodded, wary but open. She led Miss Marple to the back garden, where a small wrought iron table stood beneath a gnarled apple tree. The remains of 2 cups and a half-eaten scone sat upon it. I had tea with Basil Hammond yesterday, Clara said, without preamble. He thinks I'm foolish for clinging to Verity's memory. Mr. Hammond is a man of strong opinions. Miss Marple replied mildly, but not always of sound ones. They sat in silence for a moment before Miss Marple continued. Verity was hiding something, not out of deceit, but protection, and I believe she wanted to pass that burden to you. Clara looked down at her hands. She told me once that people in Little Fallowford believed only what was convenient. that they didn't see what was behind their own curtains. Wise of her. It's not uncommon for small villages to maintain peace through carefully cultivated blindness. Do you think? Clara hesitated. Do you think someone in this village killed her? Miss Marple's voice was low. Yes, I do. Meanwhile, Inspector Grant was growing restless. The floral thread had gone cold. The musician's connection remained tenuous, and none of the villagers had motives strong enough to bridge the leap from resentment to murder except one. He paid another visit to Basil Hammond. The solicitor greeted him with his usual sharp formality, his study heavy with books and framed certificates. He motioned to a chair. You're persistent, Inspector. Still not convinced Miss Larchmere's death was unfortunate chance? It wasn't chance at all, Grant said. I believe it was calculated, and I believe she knew something about someone's past that could have resurfaced with legal consequences. Basil's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting blackmail? Not at all. I'm suggesting truth. Something Verity discovered, something buried deep, possibly even something that threatened an inheritance or a reputation, something that frightened someone enough to kill. Basil exhaled, slow and measured. You won't find anything here. I never had any financial dealings with her. She never asked me for advice, never sought help. Then you won't mind if I speak to your housekeeper? Grant said evenly. She may have seen visitors, heard music, perhaps even found a letter or two for the first time. A flicker passed across Basil Hammond's composed exterior. She doesn't speak English well, polish, and she's loyal. Grant stood. That's often the problem with loyalty. It keeps the wrong people silent. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a letter. It had no return address. The handwriting was smooth, foreign, and unfamiliar. Miss Marple, you are cleverer than you let on. But please leave this alone. There is danger in old music and older love. Do not look for the man in the gray suit. He has suffered enough. A French folded the letter slowly. Danger in old music, she murmured. Or perhaps, in the one who remembers it. That evening, she invited Clara and Inspector Grant to tea once more, this time placing not just the embroidered doily on the table, but also Verity's sheet music. The faded page trembled slightly in the candle's breeze. Clara studied it. It's a piece by Thorne. I recognize the structure now. The last bars, they repeat the motif of La Sonate du Secret. Miss Marple nodded. He was known for it, a theme hidden in every composition, a lover's fingerprint, and Verity must have recognized it. That's why she ordered the corsage. She was sending a message not to the villagers, but to her father. Grant leaned in. You think she knew he was alive? I think she hoped, Miss Marple said. And I think someone else discovered she was getting close. That night, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, the letter open beside her, her fingers resting on a long-forgotten piano score she had borrowed from the library. La Sonate du Secret. The melody, when played aloud, sounded fractured, haunting, unresolved. But Miss Marple knew that some music only revealed itself in silence. She looked at the final bar. A rest, a pause, then a single note G-sharp, a sharp end, she whispered, to a soft-spoken song, and in her mind, the next step became clear. It was time to meet the ghost himself. Chapter 8. A melody rehearsed in shadows. It was nearly dusk when Miss Marple made her way to the outskirts of Little Fallowford, following a path lined with brambles and old hawthorn trees. The wind had turned, cooler now, scented with moss and wet stone. She walked with purpose, the folded letter tucked neatly into her handbag, her gloves buttoned as if for a formal visit. Her destination was an ivy-strangled cottage hidden at the edge of the old woods, an abandoned gardener's residence from the estate that once belonged to the Lanchesters. Local children believed it haunted. Most grown-ups pretended it didn't exist. But Miss Marple had seen the faint thread of smoke rising from its crooked chimney. 2 nights in a row, she approached silently, noting the footprints in the damp earth, a faint scratch on the doorframe where a key had been hurriedly inserted. The curtains were drawn. She knocked once, then twice. No response. "I'm not the police," she said aloud to the door. "And I am far too old to chase ghosts." Silence. Then, slowly, the door opened just an inch, and I, pale green and weary, looked through. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne." A pause. Then the door swung wide enough to admit her. Maurice Thorne was older, thinner, and far more broken than the dashing portrait painted in village memory. His hair, once black, was now streaked with silver. His left hand trembled, but the eyes held the same intensity. Clara Carradine had once described a feverish depth that hinted at both genius and despair. "I suppose you've come to turn me in," he muttered, drawing a chair for her with visible effort. "You and the inspector both. You've always watched people too closely. I've only come to ask for the truth," Miss Marple replied, settling into the chair and accepting the cup of weak tea he offered. "And to understand why Verity died." Maurice flinched. "She was my daughter," Miss Marple had suspected, but the quiet declaration carried the weight of tragedy. "She never told anyone," he continued. "Not even me. Not until I returned and saw her. We met only once. She was waiting by the yew tree in the churchyard. She handed me the doily one Edith had made long ago and said nothing except, 'I know now.'" Tears glistened in his eyes. "I'd watched from afar. I thought she might hate me for disappearing. But she forgave. She said I had to stay hidden, that I was safer that way. She knew someone had betrayed Edith's memory, driven her to her death. She didn't say who, only that it was someone I once trusted." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And the corsage?" "She said it was part of a plan, that she needed someone to see it, someone from the past. I thought she meant me, but perhaps she meant the one who'd tried to bury the past," Miss Marple said softly. Later that night, she returned to her cottage and wrote a note to Inspector Grant. "You must gather everyone at the church hall by noon tomorrow. All those involved: Clara, Basil, Mrs. Hargreaves, even young Elsie. It is time to end this charade with as much grace as we can manage. And bring the sheet. Music. She folded the note and sealed it with wax. The next morning dawned pale and still. The villagers, summoned by official word and unofficial gossip, gathered in the church hall with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Miss Marple stood at the front, hands folded neatly. Beside a small upright piano borrowed from the school, Inspector Grant stood to one side, arms crossed, watching. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice steady. "We are here to mourn Verity Larchmere. Yes, but also to understand why she died." Murmurs passed among the gathered crowd. Basil Hammond scowled. Clara looked pale. Elsie bit her lip. Miss Marple continued. "Verity was not merely a kind young woman. She was a seeker of truth, and she uncovered something long buried, a betrayal that cost her mother her life. Her murder, I'm afraid, was an echo of that first tragedy." Gasps rang out. "She ordered a corsage not for fashion, but as a signal, a symbol stitched into memory. She also planted a clue in a piece of music. That music, you'll find, repeats a motif known only to those who knew Maurice Thorne, the man some of you assumed dead." Another wave of whispers. Miss Marple nodded to the inspector, who opened the doors. Maurice entered quietly, his face unreadable. Several villagers recoiled. Basil dropped his cane. "You lied," Clara whispered, trembling. "You said he was dead." "I believed he was," Basil replied quickly. "I swear Edith told me he'd vanished. There was a letter, no return address." You assumed wrong," Miss Marple said gently. "And Verity paid the price." She turned to the room. "There is more. Verity knew someone else had lied to Edith decades ago. Someone who intercepted letters. Someone who forged one to drive Edith away from Maurice. Someone who hoped to marry her, or perhaps ruin her. Her eyes settled on Basil. You were in love with Edith. He paled. Yes, I was. But she never loved me. So you forged Morris's letter. No proof. He snapped. There is now. Inspector Grant said, holding up a torn envelope. Recovered from Verity's study. The handwriting matches yours. And there's more bank drafts, a confession Edith never mailed. It was all there, hidden beneath the false bottom of Verity's sewing chest. Miss Marple stepped aside. She knew the truth. She confronted you. And when she refused to keep your secret, Basil collapsed into the pew. I didn't mean to kill her, he whispered, just to frighten her. But she fell. She hit the hearthstone. I panicked. I arranged the scene, burned the letters, all except the one I couldn't find. The one she placed in the corsage box, Miss Marple said. A final safeguard. The hall remained silent as the constable approached Basil Hammond and took him gently by the arm. Miss Marple looked toward Maurice, who sat quietly in the last row. You've been silent long enough, she said. It's time to live again. Maurice gave a nod, subtle but real. As the villagers slowly filed out, Miss Marple remained seated at the piano, her fingers trailing across the keys. She played the final bars of La Sonate du Secret, the hidden melody rising at last, full and clear, no longer obscured by silence. And in that final note, the village of Little Fallowford, too, exhaled. Chapter 9. Threads beneath the lacy there in Little Fallowford had shifted, not quite cleared, but dense with anticipation. Following the emotional reckoning at the church hall, whispers clung to the hedgerows like early morning fog. No one spoke too loudly, as if afraid that the truth might still shift underfoot like loose gravel. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly persistent. There was still something unresolved, a final thread in the tapestry that didn't sit quite right. She sat by her cottage window that morning, sipping a modest cup of tea, rereading the fragment of Verity's letter Inspector Grant had passed her. The last line had snagged her attention like a thorn. If I am not believed, let the doily speak for me. Let its center be unpicked, and my mother's voice heard once more. A curious metaphor. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that young women often encoded their deepest truths in poetry and stitchwork alike. She reached for the delicate doily, so innocent, so ordinary, still tucked in a small embroidered pouch. Its lace was intricate, but her fingers, though old, were still deft. With care, she began to unpick the central rosette. One loop, then another. Her sewing needle slipped beneath the tightest knot and paused. Something resisted. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A fragment of fine parchment had been sewn into the heart of the doily, cleverly disguised by the white thread. She freed it gently, unfolding the small piece. On it was a musical notation, simple, spare, haunting. Not Verity's handwriting. No, this was older, heavier. Almost certainly Edith's. And below the staff lines, a message: truth repeats until heard. Miss Marple sat back, deeply still. So it was not only a message, she murmured. It was a repetition, a cry disguised as memory. Later that day, she walked the familiar path toward Carradine House, now quiet and formal under the pall of recent events. Clara had not left the grounds since the revelation about Basil, and Elsie had returned to the kitchen, quiet but observant. The house itself seemed to exhale in Miss Marple's presence, its many rooms still ripe with secrets. Clara met her in the drawing room, arms folded tightly. I'm not sure what more there is to uncover, she said, eyes rimmed with fatigue. Verity was your answer, Basil your villain. Miss Marple sat down calmly and withdrew the small square of parchment from her handbag. She left us something else. Or rather, Edith did, hidden in the doily's center. I believe this motif, this melody, was part of something larger, and Verity knew it. Clara reached for the parchment, but Miss Marple held it back a moment longer. Clara, did you know Edith composed music before she died? Clara hesitated. I remember hearing her play. But it was Maurice who composed, wasn't it? They collaborated. Quietly, she wrote lyrics. He wrote music. But before she died, she wrote one piece alone, the Widow's Canticle. Maurice mentioned it briefly, as if afraid to say more. I believe Verity found it. Clara's face went pale. Where? That's what I'd like to know. She may have hidden it here, or copied parts of it into her journals. But I suspect she wove it into the music. Basil claimed was his own, the piece he played for the festival. Verity transcribed and arranged it. Clara's voice caught. Are you saying Basil stole Edith's composition? I'm saying he stole more than her heart. He stole her voice. And Verity uncovered it. With Inspector Grant's help, they retrieved Basil's old music sheets from the study. Carefully pressed between pages, Miss Marple found Verity's transcription notes. Her annotations were meticulous. And there it was again, the same haunting phrase stitched into the doily. Truth repeats until heard. The motif appeared subtly, buried in the second movement. Miss Marple smiled grimly. She wanted us to hear it, truly hear it. That evening, the village hall was filled again, not with suspicion this time, but with the trembling hush that precedes an unveiling. Clara Carradine, though shaken, sat at the small upright piano under Miss Marple's guidance. She was your niece. Miss Marple had told her, let her melody be yours to free. And so Clara played. Slowly, the first bars tentative, then stronger, then aching with a grief neither Clara nor the villagers could name. The final phrase, Edith's phrase, rose clear and unflinching through the hall, like a voice long muffled finding breath. Miss Marple closed her eyes. A silence followed that no one dared to disturb. Then came tears, quiet, dignified, a scattering of applause, and something even more fragile, peace outside the hall, under the stars. Miss Marple walked home alone. Her steps were unhurried. The wind had returned, softer now, rustling the hedges as if whispering secrets back to the land. She paused beneath the old yew tree where Verity had once waited for her father, where Edith had once wept alone, where, perhaps, every secret of little Fallowford had passed through silence before becoming truth. She placed the doily, now mended and whole, on the low stone wall. May you both rest, she said. And then, with the stars above and the village exhaling around her, Miss Marple returned to her quiet home, her mind already drifting toward the next question the world would pose. But not tonight. Tonight, there was only stillness and the soft, unwavering sound of a melody finally heard. Chapter 10. The note that was meant to wither. The evening light dipped low over little Fallowford, casting golden shadows across the rose bushes and garden gates. The village, though still murmuring over what had transpired at Carradine House, had settled into that peculiar calm that follows revelation. Yet within the quiet, something still prickled beneath the surface. Not everyone, Miss Marple sensed, had truly understood the truth behind Verity's death. Miss Marple stood once again in the drawing room of Carradine House, now shorn of its former illusions. The air no longer carried the sweet deception of lavender water and lemon polish. It smelled simply like dust and time. Clara Carradine sat across from her, hands wrapped tightly around a china teacup, untouched. Her eyes, tired and damp, had watched Miss Marple closely since the music recital the night before. You said it was Basil's doing, Clara said quietly. But Verity's death, there was something in it that still felt unfinished. Miss Marple nodded. Because it was. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small envelope. The paper had aged poorly, damp corners, fading ink, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Verity's, unearthed only that morning in the pocket lining of the green wool coat the girl had worn on the night she vanished, forgotten in the corner of the old scullery wardrobe. I believe she intended to send this to you, Miss Marple said gently. It's her final letter. Clara opened it slowly, reading with trembling fingers. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger as Clara's eyes scanned the page. Aunt Clara, I've learned something I wish I hadn't. Basil's composition, it isn't his. He stole it from Edith's notebook. I confronted him. He denied it, but I saw the panic. If something happens to me, don't trust what they say. I was never careless with where I walked. I would never fall. The doily holds the rest. Please listen. Verity. Tears spilled silently down Clara's cheeks, though her expression held no surprise, just grief that had found its proper shape. She tried to tell me. I was so caught up in Basil's charm, his ambitions. I thought Verity's jealousy was simply youthful pride. I failed her. No, Miss Marple said softly. You believed what you were meant to believe. Basil was practiced at deception. He manipulated Verity's silence into shame and used your trust to shield himself. Clara pressed the letter to her chest, then looked up with sudden urgency. But how did he? I mean, her death, it was said to be an accident. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed gently. Yes, that was the official version. But it wasn't the truth. That morning, Inspector Grant had confirmed the detail that had eluded everyone. A re-examination of the cliff path had revealed scuff marks on the ledge's mossy edge to sets of footprints. One matched Verity's shoes. The other, larger, did not. The spacing suggested a confrontation, a backward stumble, and then nothing. It was staged to appear accidental. But Verity had not fallen. She had been pushed. And the corsage? Clara asked now, eyes red. She always wore it at the festival. But it was missing when they found her. Miss Marple reached into her bag once more. Basil kept it. Clara recoiled slightly. He likely tore it from her dress in the struggle. Hid it. A small token of control, or perhaps a guilty keepsake. It was found behind the panel in his piano bench. Still wilted. Still stained. There was no denying it now. Basil had silenced Verity, just as he had silenced Edith by taking her music. He had built his reputation on the voices of women who could no longer speak. Later that evening, Inspector Grant officially closed the case. The village gathered in hushed clusters, absorbing the revelation with the usual blend of pity, horror, and satisfaction. Basil Carradine would face justice. Clara, though shattered, had begun to speak openly about the family's fractured history. Even Elsie, the housemaid, stood straighter, no longer weighed down by unspoken knowledge. And Miss Marple, well, she declined any praise. I merely noticed what others overlooked, she said with her familiar smile. Human nature, after all, does not change. One simply has to pay attention. The next morning, as sun pierced the hedges and doves cooed above the rectory gate, Miss Marple sat once more in her parlor, embroidering a small doily of her own. This one bore no secrets, just a simple rose motif, elegant in its symmetry. But as her needle traced its pattern, her mind replayed the melody from the night before. Edith's music, Verity's warning, Clara's redemption. And little Fallowford. The corsage had wilted, but the truth had finally bloomed. And so, she stitched in silence, with the faintest smile, knowing that even the gentlest of threads could pull the tightest knots apart.